Let's talk about some combat patrols and starter sets, and a bunch of other kits that maybe just give you a little bit more quality plastic for your money. Let's do a top 10 of some of Games Workshop's best value options in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, and today we're talking Warhammer kits, and seeing as in the not too distant past I made a video focusing on some of the worst value Warhammer kits that Games Workshop produces. I'll link that one down in the video description below. But in this video I thought it would be worth rounding up a bunch of the more positive kits from Games Workshop, at least relatively speaking. For people looking to buy Warhammer kits, there's quite a lot of ways that you could judge value of miniatures. Certainly the recency and the quality of the sculpts compared with most, though I feel having more plastic for your money is generally a good feeling as well, as opposed to just like tiny character miniatures that might be nice sculpts but cost a lot of money per model. And a metric that I quite like is points per dollar, how many points on the board that you get for your money, as that does tend to be a pretty nice rough and ready metric for how many copies of these style units you need to make an army of any given size. They generally tend to reflect in-game power and excitement as well, making it quite a helpful numerical value. For this list I thought I'd just go through a rough and very arbitrary top 10 of model kits in Warhammer 40k, just to highlight the kits that seem a bit better than most for one reason or another, and talk through some of my favourites in the range. For this one as well I thought I'd do a mix of kits, including a fair few just standard units, and not just talk about combat patrols and nothing else, even though they are some of the best deals for most of the factions in the game right now. I'll mention a couple of those but not go through every one. If you want a bit more of a breakdown for that, I've also made a video ranking the combat patrols. Feel free to give that a search if interested. Before I start, I think with Warhammer 40k kits you generally need to have some caveats when you say good value. Obviously Warhammer kits from a materials sort of point of view are really considered very expensive by many. After they've done the designs and made the molds, Games Workshop makes massive profits on any individual box of miniatures that they sell, minus things like logistics, shipping and staffing of their stores. Lots of people see their prices as generally quite high, though obviously they still make plenty of sales. They are a multi-million-dollar company. But when you talk about good value, I certainly would bear in mind the other options that aren't just direct from Games Workshop. Third-party discount retailers that often give a percentage off the same models as Games Workshop sells, 3D printed miniatures, and all the options for near proxies that people come out with, things that look kinda similar to 40k stuff and could be used in a pinch, alternative miniature producers with all sorts of sci-fi and fantasy type minis, and second-hand options, say getting Warhammer from eBay. I bear in mind all of those as ways that you could reduce costs compared with these kits directly from Games Workshop. Getting into the slightly arbitrary top 10 though, first up we have the Orc Stompa, £85, $140 or €110 from Games Workshop. And while it's definitely a bit of an older plastic kit, I feel like maybe it's worth a mention in terms of the 40k value things, as it both has the option to fill out an enormous chunk of an orc army, but mainly just gets you an enormous amount of plastic for the cost compared with just about any other Games Workshop miniature. Compared with just about every other 40k model that Games Workshop sells, the Stompa is pretty enormous, absolutely dwarfing things like Imperial Knights, never mind things like Morkanauts or Gorkanauts, which are smaller than them. And it is kind of surprising that, given that the Gorkanaut and the Morkanaut cost around about the same price as the Stompa. I think it is quite a good fun miniature as well, basically a great big walking trash can with some characterful grots swarming all over it, hitting things with hammers. Quite a nice great big centerpiece for an Orky army as a massive effigy to Gork or possibly Mork. I think it also does remain the highest points per dollar in the entire Orc army as well, almost 6 as it's currently 800 points. Though as any Orc player will tell you, all this stuff comes with caveats. Games Workshop seem to be allergic to ever making the Stompa any good in game. Usually they just seem to like it being vastly overcosted compared with its abilities, and in general it's not going to add much strength to a list. The size of the thing can be pretty problematic for any sort of competitive play as well, potentially not really being able to fit through gaps in ruins and things as it's enormous, which could further limit its role on the battlefield even if it were good for the points. Overall though, I think it does its job as the Orky centerpiece super heavy really quite well. Next up, and I've ranked at number 9, maybe a little bit of a curveball of a box, but it's the Age of Darkness box that's the Horus Heresy starter set when applies to Warhammer 40k, either with a Space Marine or a Chaos Space Marine army. This one is one of the most expensive kits that Games Workshop gets, but you do get quite a lot for your money, I'd say. £185, $310 or €240, but essentially you do get an entire Space Marine army in one box here, and I would say that pretty much all of the models can be adapted for use in 40k, either with certain choices of gear or a little bit of minimal proxying. In this box you get 2 Legion Praetors, which will work quite nicely for certain things like captains, or maybe using for other characters with a little bit of conversion. Definitely could be nice options to raid the bits box and equip them as certain heroes of your choice. The Cataphractii Terminators are pretty good to adapt for either Chaos Marines or regular Space Marines. Just choose to arm them in a way that's consistent with regular Terminators or the Chaos Terminators. For the Spartan, you could use its Legends datasheet, though I'd just be tempted to run it as a standard Land Raider. The only major weapon difference is the change in the number of las cannons, and you could just either model it with less or just count them as a single twin-link las cannon on the sponsons. The Tactical Marines gets you an enormous amount of beakies. They would work fine as either Tactical Marines for Space Marines, Chaos Legionaries with bolters, or could perhaps use to represent intercessors in a pinch. And then finally for the Contemptor Dreadnought, you could arm it in a way that represents either a Space Marine regular Dreadnought or a Hellbrute perhaps, or again just use the Legends datasheet if you fancy it. It would probably require a little bit of thinking outside of the box and would get you a 40k type army of a certain aesthetic, very retro and throwback to the days of the Heresy of course, but I feel like it's perhaps not the worst for certain armies. Iron Warriors work very well with the Cataphractii Terminators I think, and all the beakies in the Tactical Marines could maybe make it a bit more interesting for armies like Raven Guard for the Loyalist side of things. For this many multi-part miniatures though, it's really not doing too badly. If you ran it as Chaos Space Marines, that'd be 1600 points of them or thereabouts, around about 5 points per dollar, and you could also potentially resell the big rulebook if you were buying it for 40k and not Heresy, unless you just wanted the Age of Darkness book for a bit of info on both systems. Next up, perhaps for a more standard unit, I feel like the Armigers and War Dogs for the Imperial and Chaos Knights don't do too badly by Games Workshop standards. They're £55, $90 or €70 for the pair of them, and given that they're fairly dangerous Dreadnought equivalent type models, they do come at a price tag that's really quite a lot less per miniature compared with an awful lot of things that Games Workshop have released in recent years, or similar sort of price tags to much smaller vehicles. Per model, they're the same price as Imperial Guard Sentinels, which is kind of surprising given that they cost way less points and are a much smaller walker. The same goes for Admech Iron Striders, and they actually cost more per model than Armiger or War Dog. Again, a bit odd given that they're less points intensive and generally just don't feel like they're in the same weight class. Or if you say compare it to another relatively recent vehicle release, the two of these are the same price as one Space Marine Gladiator. Perhaps a little bit more raw plastic and a slightly heavier vehicle than these two, but they do cost similar sort of points in game, and getting two of these versus one of those is just a massive value upgrade. On top of that, both of the kits, and particularly the War Dogs, have a whole load of options, and they're pretty easy to magnetise as well. And for points per dollar, they're 3.3, that's not too bad comparatively speaking to other similar kits. Next up and ranked in 7th are the 10-man Space Marine boxes, say for example the Primaris Hellblasters, and they come at a price tag of £37.50, $60 or €50. There's a few other Space Marine kits that are around about this kind of price level, regular and Assault Intercessors, Grey Knights, and Chaos Space Marine Legionaries. Again, relative to other units, I feel like the majority of Space Marines that are boxed in sets of 10 generally tends to be pretty good value for money comparatively. They're generally quite elite and chunky miniatures, so you get a fair amount of plastic, usually a good amount of options, and they take up a fair amount of points on the board. These Hellblasters are perhaps a particularly good example for that point of view, 250 points on the board, or 4.2 points per dollar. Again, compared with the rest of Games Workshop's range, just looking at some of the other kits there maybe make them look good by comparison. There are a fair few elite infantry type boxes that both cost fewer points than the Hellblasters, plus you only get 5 of them in the box. Say for example, Adeptus Mechanicus Rust Stalkers for $60 for 5 of them, or Sisters of Battle Retributors, both of those cost less points than the Hellblasters, and you also get 5 of them rather than 10. Next up we've got combat patrols in general. I decided that I didn't really want to make this video into just listing a whole bunch of individual combat patrols for each and every faction, so I've mainly focused to feature on just 2 or 3 of them, the Drukhari combat patrol being one of the examples. Maybe other particularly quite nice ones are Grey Knights, World Eaters and Eldari, though I feel like for just about every faction that has one it's a pretty reasonable place to start the army. Even for the ones that are less popular like Death Guard and Thousand Sons with their overabundance of their unique cultists, I think they're still pretty reasonable purchases to fill that niche in the army and then go on to expand to some more mainline units. Combat Patrol Drukhari though I think is particularly standout out of them, and in the box you get an Archon, 10 Cabalite Warriors, 5 Incubi, a Raider and a Ravager, all priced for £95, €125 or $160. The discount is fairly good compared with buying these separately at around about 40%, and the points per dollar is around about 3, which maybe isn't standout compared with a few of the things on this list, but generally for Drukhari standards that tends to be a pretty good deal. I feel like this one's one of the more feel-good combat patrols, as you get 2 exciting gunboats to have on the go. You could magnetize the Ravager to be able to have the option to field it as a second raider if you like, and those kits are just quite nice in the first place. Some of the most iconic things of the faction, and do get you a whole bunch of plastic in the box. Then there's some Cavalite warriors and an Archon, perhaps the most stereotypical troops choice in HQ for the faction, plus some cool melee specialist incubi, some of the most recent and nicest sculpts that the Drukhari have, and tend to be a fun and pretty exciting unit to use in combat hacking down Space Marines. As combat patrols go, I feel like this is one that Games Workshop really got right. I feel like if they chose to sub out any of the units for something else, for the most part they'd probably make it worse. Next up, and maybe for another slightly less obvious one, at number 5 I ranked the Chaos Space Marine Warpforged, the slightly unusual combination of a Venom Crawler and 2 Obliterators, previously released in the Shadowspear box set, then the Chaos Start Collecting box, and now only available direct from Games Workshop's web store, which is perhaps just a little bit disappointing as it means that you can't get any discounts on them, as they don't let third-party retailers stock them. There definitely are a few pros and cons to the kit. They are monopose models, though I'd argue they're some of the nicer sculpts out of the entire Chaos Space Marine range. I really do quite like the hulking Obliterators, and I thought they were an excellent update on the previous models. I guess the fact that they're packaged together might turn some people off them. I admit it would be quite nice to have the option to buy any of the units separately if people just wanted one but not the other. Still though, for recent miniature sculpts of this sort of size and weight and points value in game, I feel like Games Workshop would often charge a lot more for this. Vehicles the size of the Venom Crawler often go around about the £40 sort of mark, so having this plus the Obliterators for 45 is rather nice. Plus they are one of the better ways to get points of Chaos Space Marines on the table. 290 points in game at the moment, so 3.8 points per dollar. If you're just looking to assemble as many points of a Chaos Space Marine army for as cheap as possible, this one does have a slightly better ratio than the Chaos Space Marine Combat Patrol. Cycling back to Combat Patrols again, and perhaps one of the single best ones out of any of them is Combat Patrol Genestealer Cults. Again, like the Drukhari, I feel like over and above the other Combat Patrols that Games Workshop has, this one deserves a special mention. Here we've got a Magus, 20 Neophyte Hybrids, 5 Acolytes that you can also build as Metamorphs, 5 Aberrants, and a Goliath truck that you can also build as a Rock Grinder. Again, this one is at the usual Combat Patrol price of £95, €125 or $160, and it adds up to one of the best discounts on buying the kits individually out of any of the Combat Patrols at around about 46% off. The kits included are generally quite nice ones as well if you like the Genestealer Cult Mutant Mining aesthetic. Their army is a pretty recent plastic range. I think it is perhaps particularly feel good, as the Genestealer Cults are pretty renowned for being one of the most expensive armies to collect in Warhammer 40K, though the existence of this set does massively help them get into line with some of the other 40k factions out there, which is definitely a good thing. Genestealer Cult tend to be a lot more points intensive in 10th edition. They started out just being a lot more costly than usual due to their respawning thing, but then Games Workshop increased their cost again due to them winning loads of games. Now there's 655 points worth of models in the box, all the way up to 4.1 points per dollar. That does make them, I believe, one of the top 3 of points that you can get in a Combat Patrol set. I think genuinely if I was starting Genestealer Cults afresh, I would probably get either 2 or 3 copies of this set. Most of the units contained within you could justify multiple copies of, plus there are the multi-build options for the Acolytes plus the Rock Grinder. I guess only the Mages is something that you might not want that many of, though I guess you could potentially resell one of the copies of those models, or convert it into one of their different specialist characters. Next up, in 3rd place, I thought I'd rank the standard Custodian Guard box set, and kind of going off a similar vein, seeing as they're in it, they sort of tie in with the Custodian's Combat Patrol, where they're a good factor into why it's such great value. For chunky 40k elites, I feel like these are about some of the best value that Games Workshop offers. And again, like the Hellblasters, if you do compare them to some of other Games Workshop's offerings, it is funny when you get 5 of these bulky demigods of war for the same price as you get things like 5 Sisters of Battle Retributors or 5 Adeptus Mechanicus, Ruststalkers or Infiltrators. I think the models have really quite a nice look and feel to them, really quite ornate and detailed, while not really being all that hard to paint either if you go for simplistic gold type effects. Being custodians of the Emperor's finest, they cost an awful lot of points in game. A squad of 5 of them goes for 250 points at the moment, which is over 4 points per dollar just for the basic Custodians troops. And you also have the option to build one up as a shield captain as well. Again, another massive win for the box set there, given that for other factions, generally Games Workshop charges something like £25 or $35 for individual character miniatures, and just getting one in the box set alongside a very efficient main squad is pretty awesome. As a knock-on effect, it does make Combat Patrol Adeptus Custodes particularly good value. Realistically, it's these guys and the Virtus Praetors that make the box feel quite such a nice deal for how much it costs. They just bring quite a lot more bulk and excitement to the box compared with the Sisters of Silence. Definitely nice to have, but quite expensive cost individually for really quite unelite models. Between these guys, the Virtus Praetors and the Terminators, they're all good factors as to why Custodians are quite so popular a faction to collect. Very cheap for the amount of points that you put on the table, and also not that many models to paint up as well if you do want to collect the faction and get a full army on the go. For second on the list, I thought I'd do a bit of a combined entry, and talk about in particular the Leviathan box, but a few other out of production sets as well. Things that I think might be well worth being aware of, but maybe aren't quite so helpful for newer players, as you can't just get hold of these reliably just by ordering them from Games Workshop or somewhere. It might be more a case of noticing that one of them goes at a deal second hand on eBay, or you might find one or two of these boxes turn up in an independent stockist from time to time who just haven't sold them for ages, perhaps particularly ones that don't have an enormous online presence where people just buy them out and order them in. I feel like most people watching will be well aware what Leviathan is. This was the big 10th edition launch box set with an enormous amount of Tyranids and Space Marines. Quite an expensive kit at $250, but also for the amount and quality of the plastic sculpts, I feel like you could argue it's one of Games Workshop's best deals that they've ever made, at least in terms of amounts and quality of models per the amount of money that you pay. Given that so many of these were made and sold, it seems kind of likely that there'll be Space Marines and Tyranids from it popping up on eBay for quite some time to come. It should still be possible to land a bunch of these miniatures for reasonably good deals for a while, though that is going to diminish over time. Otherwise, to rattle through a few other highlights over the past few years from Games Workshop, this Custodes Battle Force, the Watchers of the Gates, was maybe particularly handy for just being able to start a whole Custodes army very easily indeed. 15 Custodian Guard, 3 Virtus Praetors, and 3 Terminators plus Trajan Valoris, almost the entire plastic line of the army with no Sisters of Silence to dilute down the elite golden goodness. This one was absolutely enormously popular from last year's Christmas Battle Force box sets. Maybe the other truly standout one from last year's Christmas Battle Forces was this Chainbreaker Lance. This one almost felt like Combat Patrol Imperial Knights, going for $210. A Questoris Knight that you could build as any of the standard ones, plus 2 Armiger Warglaves and 2 Helverins. A set that you could basically just buy 2 of and have an entire Imperial or Chaos Knight army on the go. Kind of a shame that this sort of box set doesn't stick around, though I guess if it did, then very few people would actually buy the individual Armigers or Questoris kits, as it's just better to get them here. Otherwise, going back a little bit further, the launch box for 9th edition with Indomitus was very standout as well. A huge amount of Necrons and Space Marines on a similar sort of level as Leviathan. It cost a little bit less, but there was a little bit less in terms of size and scope of miniatures. Again, it was one of the best deals that Games Workshop ever released. Following on from Indomitus, there was the Recruit starter set. This one was basically the same price as a box of Necron Warriors, but also included you a Royal Warden character, plus 5 Assault Intercessors and a Primaris Lieutenant. I believe that was around about a 60% decrease on what Games Workshop might have usually sold them for, and again was a ridiculously good deal while it was around. Occasionally you might see them pop up as well. And finally, for a selective trip down memory lane, I did think that the No Fear box set from 8th edition was another enormously standout one. I believe that this one was around about £60 or $90, maybe even a little bit less than that, and you basically got little forces that were pretty much akin to lots of combat patrols out there at the moment. For the Space Marines it was Intercessors, Hellblasters, Inceptors and a Captain, and for the Death Guard it was Poxwalkers, Plague Marines, a Lord of Contagion and a Bloat Drone. Just for sheer focus on the miniatures and 2 little armies all in one box for surprisingly cheap. Again, this was one of the best deals that they had going at the time. Finally though, and the kit that I've chosen to rank in number 1 is the current 40k starter set. This one does very much feel like 9th edition version of some of the previous kits like the No Fear one, or a similar sort of value saving to Recruit or Elite in 9th edition. The standard 40k starter set is £65, $110 or €85, and it gets you this little force of Tyranids and Space Marines, a subset of the miniatures within the Leviathan box set, but does include some really quite fun sculpts I think. I do like the Space Marine Terminators and Captain, and the Psychophage and the Von Rhein's Leapers are really nice as well. Again, by Games Workshop standards, this is a surprising amount of models for the money, has a fairly astronomical points per dollar value of 7.2, much higher than just about anything else they've got on currently on offer at the moment. And though it's a little bit annoying in that you don't get the full combat patrols here, you can very easily build out to either one of the faction's combat patrols, either by picking up the Terminator Librarian or the Barb Gaunts. It is definitely a kit that does have some downsides though. The models are split between two different armies, so unless you collect both Space Marines and Tyranids, it's going to have far more value if you say resell or split the box set, unless you just wanted the other half of the miniatures for a painting project or something. Otherwise, the model sculpts are monoposed, though I would argue that they're quite nice ones, or really quite recent ones, and the new Terminators in particular are very cool and chunky. And unlike the multi-part plastic kits, they are missing a few options. Perhaps most notably, the Termagants don't have the options of their different guns or the new special weapons that their box set gets with the new codex. And the Terminators don't have the different heavy weapon options. In particular, I think that they'll miss the option for the Cyclone missile launcher if you wanted one of those. I feel like they're downsides that can be worked with though. You could think about converting either of those to get the war gear bits if you wanted, and take a bunch of value saving into the bargain. Overall, I feel like they've done quite well as a fairly fitting successor to things like Recruit, Elite, and No Fear, the price being deliberately kept lower than the rest of their range to encourage new players to take up 40k. When talking about that, it's definitely worth mentioning the Ultimate Starter set as well. I personally prefer the one that's a little bit more focused on the models myself, but for plenty of people the Ultimate set might be the right choice. It's just under double the price, but for that you get the Terminator Librarian, Barb Gaunts, Terrain, and the mini rulebook as well. Kind of depends if you're going to get good value out of all of those elements, or some of them might be a bit wasted on you. I certainly rate it as another comparable value option though, depending on what you're looking for. So anyway, let me know what you think. Hope you've enjoyed a rundown of a few of Games Workshop's better offerings in terms of plastic kits that they sell. By all means, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and if there's any other kits that you'd particularly like to shout out. I suspect I'll get a fair few comments about other combat patrols, again though I just wanted to focus on a couple of those as well as the other kits rather than making this a full combat patrol video again. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe and see more like this from Auspex Tactics, and I'll leave a link to the counterpart video for this link down in the video description with a few of Games Workshop's worst kits that they have on sale. Finally, if you've enjoyed the video, then I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and if you'd like to help support the channel and keep these videos coming, then any support over on there is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.